Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is another Tuesday takedown, not of people, just of bad ideas, bad arguments, and bad apologetics. And today we have all three. I'm going to be reacting to a video from Allen Parr. Allen has a huge presence. He has over 1 million subscribers on YouTube and this online project that he calls BEAT, which stands for Biblical Encouragement and Truth, which I don't see in this video. It's a 1-minute short where he is talking about grace, also consequence, and he's using the book of Judges to do so. It seems confused and muddy and simply wrong. So we're going to go through it, and it might end up being a little bit more about the book of Judges, but it won't be anything like what we've covered in this high-level detail here. It'll be on the story of the Benjamites. Before I show you his video to get things started, the conversation I had with Trent Horn about my video on the 7 Problems of Paradise should be up on his channel as of yesterday. I'll be posting it on my channel here in a week or two, but if you want to see it before then, you can go watch it over there. I warn you, it's pretty long, but I think it was a really good conversation, and this was the first chance I've had to talk with someone from the other side. So let me know how I did. But back to today's video, let's see what Allen Parr has to say.
God has grace for us even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. Notice how the book of Judges ends. It says here, the Benjaminites did this and took the number of women they needed from the dancers they caught. They went back to their own inheritance, rebuilt their cities, and lived in them. At that time, each of the Israelites returned from there to his own tribe and family. Each returned from there to his own inheritance. And then, of course, the last verse in the book of Judges characterizes and describes the entire book of Judges. It says here, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. I want to encourage you to understand that every single decision you and I make have consequences, oftentimes consequences that cannot even be measured and consequences that we cannot choose.
I am really struggling with what the goal of this video from him was supposed to be. You know, he's talking at the beginning about God's grace. Then at the end, he's talking about these insane consequences of sin, consequences we might not even see the ramifications of. Avoiding consequence really is what grace means to the Christian, whether it's in this life or the next, right? God's grace for us as New Testament Jesus believing Christians is that Jesus' death paid for our sins so that we can go to heaven. Jesus is a get out of jail free card. In the Old Testament, God's grace was literally just an avoidance of the consequence of breaking the law. Most of the consequence was death. Physical death. And yet this example from Judges is the Israelites avoiding consequence. And they do so by horrendous means. They do so by murder, not just men, but women and children, only leaving young virgins alive. Also, when they were short, and we'll talk about the context of this in just a second, but when that wasn't enough and they were stuck in this weird vow they made to God out of their own anger and hatred, they went and stole 200 more virgins. Just straight up kidnapping, sexual slavery. Just because you make them get married doesn't mean all of a sudden it's not sexual slavery. And then they go off and they're fine and they're just Israel. No consequence from God. None. So the ending doesn't make any sense when he's using Judges because there is no consequence. And God's not even showing grace. This isn't a story of God's grace. He's just staying out of it. Actually, he caused the whole thing to happen with his initial command, and then he stays out of it. So I think what we're going to need is an examination of what is going on in the last chapter of Judges. And the reason that I think it's important to understand this is we all know there's problems in the Old Testament, and we all know that Christians have a multitude of ways that they try to excuse these problems. Well, one of the things they love to do is they love to point to Judges. The very last verse of the very last chapter, right before we get into our monarchy, is this, Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And they're like, see, look what happens when the people don't have a king. Look what happens when the people aren't submitting to authority. Well, that's not what it says. They still had a God, and they had never had a king before, by the way. Like, they're just putting this in as an afterthought to show the need for a monarchy. All that time wandering around, all that time as slaves, all that time back in Genesis, they never had a king. So are we excusing this whole period or just this horrendous period during the Judges? It is not saying that the Israelites were just doing what was right to them. They've been following God's law. In fact, let me kick it off by this. If we go back one chapter to Judges 20, verse 27, and the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So they may not have a king, but when they don't know what to do, they're asking God. And God said, yep, go, I'll give them into your hand. Every other time, by the way, before this, where God said, I'll give them into your hand, he's talking about the Canaanites, the Amorites, etc., other people groups outside of Israel where they go and completely annihilate them. So why were they even asking God this? Let's back up one additional step further. And that takes place starting in chapter 19. I won't read you all of 19 and 20, but you have a Levite who has a concubine, but the tribe of Benjamin had raped and murdered and dismembered her. This heinous crime, admittedly, but also of a concubine, which no one's just going to mention. I'm not saying she deserves it. I'm saying everyone's cool with the fact that there were concubines and that was okay. That's not the sin here. The sin is the rape and murder of a concubine that's not yours. Just want to point out God's great consistent morality over here. So that's when you fast forward to that verse in chapter 20 where they're asking God, what should we do? And God says, yeah, you got to go wipe them out. So it's on Israel. They go, and even without a king, they have God himself, and they go and almost wipe out the entire tribe of Benjamin. They kill every single woman and every single child, and almost all of the men. They leave 600 men. Now, to be fair, as if that's needed here, we don't get a description of the women and children getting murdered, but we know that there's only 600 people left in the tribe, and they're all men. And we know that the tribe couldn't have just been all men to begin with, or there wouldn't have been a tribe. So I don't think I'm making a reach saying that they obviously had to kill all the women and children, and tens of thousands of men also, after asking God what they should do. So again, there's a lot more to break down. I guess this turned into a little Bible study. That's fine though, because we're getting some points out of it. One, God didn't show any grace to those women and children. And if just because it's not in the Bible, you can't wrap your head around that's what happened, fine. How about the 25,000 men that died? Did all 25,000 of those men rape and murder that same concubine? How is this just at all? And it's going to get even worse when you see what everyone decides to do to compensate. And this was God's allowance. So everyone kind of stops this little civil war and they're like, whoa, wait a second. We're Israel, guys. We don't want to lose one of the entire tribes. We've got to find a way for these guys to continue on, to grow again, to pass on their name. So they go and they collect these 600 terrified men who are hiding in the caves, and they say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's get you some wives. But in their anger towards the Benjamites, I guess all of Israel, right before they went and collected these men, made a vow before God that they would not give their daughters as wives to this tribe. So even if they want to save the tribe overall, they're not willing to do so at the cost of their own daughters. They're too good for them. So where can we get women? Enter chapter 21. And I think it's worth pointing out, and you can go read it for yourself, that chapter 21 starts off with the people being sad, understanding the oath they had made that they can't get out of, and crying before God. So again, they didn't have a king, but they are in constant communion with the creator of the universe. And yet still we get these actions. So I'm going to read to you starting in verse 8. And they said, what one is there of the tribe of Israel that did not come up to the Lord to Mitzvah? And behold, no one had come from the camp of Jabesh Gilead, for when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men and commanded them, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. It's not so hard to believe that they killed all the women and little ones of the tribe of Benjamin now, is it? This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that has lain with a male you shall devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him, and they brought them to the camp. This isn't even the entire fix. Israel, because they don't want to give their own daughters, makes a quick pledge to God so that they're stuck in this oath, and then says, who can we pin this on? Was there anyone who didn't help us fight when we went to go completely annihilate the tribe of Benjamin? Yeah, the people of Jabesh Gilead didn't. Cool. Let's use that as the reasoning. We'll send our best. We'll send our bravest. Here's 12,000 men to go kill everyone, except for what? 400 virgins. I put it to you that they didn't just happen upon 400 virgins and every last one of them was at the ripe age of 18, or even culturally speaking, let's say 16, 13, etc. There were 2-year-olds, there were 5-year-olds, there were 9-year-olds, and these little virgin girls were handed over to 400 of the 600 men as wives. Yep, everything's better now. That's how the freaking chapter is described. Chapter 21, wives provided for the tribe of Benjamin. So innocuous. But we're not done yet. We're 200 short. What are we going to do? Oh, and chapter 16 actually does give us an indication that the women and children were murdered from Benjamin. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for the wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" So they did kill every last woman. And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel." That is actually, I think, what Allen here was trying to talk about in terms of God's grace. That even though this tribe went and committed this horrible act on the concubine, and even though a civil war breaks out and there's infighting, at the end of the day, God restores. Look, all his people, all 12 tribes, and how it ends and what he mentions in the video, go back to their inheritance, to their rebuilding of their families and their homes. You mean with the child rape sexual plunder that they took? Wow, God's grace is astounding. It could almost make me cry. Let's continue on. So I'm not going to read everything that happens, but it starts at verse 18 and goes through 25 if you want to read it. But here's what happens in those verses. They remind themselves that they swore this oath that not to give their own daughters. So where else can we get them? Oh, hey, there's a feast going on up at Shiloh. And usually there's a lot of young girls that go out and dance. So they tell Benjamin, "Hey, you 200 men, go and wait in ambush and snatch up as many virgins as you can get." It literally uses the word snatch. "And take them for your wives. And don't worry, we got your back. If those brothers and fathers get upset and they come to complain, we'll just explain the whole situation. We made the vow, so you're stuck losing out. Sorry." This is a workaround. They vowed not to give their daughters away, but they never made a vow that if their daughters were taken from them, like, oops, what are they to do? So we'll just work on this unsuspecting group over at Shiloh, and we'll explain that to the brothers and fathers when they come. And supposedly that works, and it's fine. And then this is where Allen kicks in and he reads this verse. "And the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. And they went out from there, every man to his inheritance." It's like and they all lived happily ever after story, except for the very last verse. "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And Christians, again, try to take this as, look at all the evil that just happened. That's because there's no authority. They needed a king. That's what you get when you just do what you think is right. They were literally doing what they thought God thought was right, because it was what God told them. It was honoring the vows that they made to God, and you don't break a vow to God. This is the biggest gaslight in the Bible. Read this book, understand the context that Christians are always carrying on about, and it becomes inexcusable, or it becomes extremely obvious that God only cares about his chosen people group and their continued line. And within that, any fighting, any civil war, any genocide, any murdering, any rape, any sexual slavery that has to happen, no problem. Was anyone cursed? No, because they all kept their special little vow to God not to give away their daughters. Did anyone get in trouble for the initial battle that killed all those women and children? Nope. It just led to an outcome where they had to go do it another time and then another time. When God doesn't like something, we hear about it. His silence here is condoning, and it's not silent. He sent them on the mission in the first place. And that stupid excuse about the last verse might make a lick of sense if it got better when they got kings. But the next book is Ruth, which is nothing, and then you get straight to the monarchy. And we get Saul and David and Solomon and on and on. And it never gets any better. There's more genocide, there's more mutilation, there's more rape, there's more concubines, there's more murder, there's more sex slavery, there's more child rape, there's more slavery straight up. Like, it doesn't get any better. If you're going to make a claim off the last verse that man left to his own devices is so evil, you have to prove that A, he was left to his own devices, which he wasn't, he was working for God, and B, that it gets better when you give him the thing you said it would take to get better, a king. And it didn't. If anything, it literally got worse. So this ended up being like a Bible study on the end part of Judges. But if we're tying it back to Allen, what I want to point out is that pastors, preachers, apologists, etc. have no problem taking difficult parts of the Bible and making up nonsense that sounds good. You know how confusing these last 2 or 3 chapters of Judges are? They're pretty confusing. Even when you read it straight, like you don't understand who's an Israelite, who's not. Wait, was that part of the tribe? No, it wasn't. Did they actually kill the women? Did they not? Right? Like, it takes effort. And most Christians aren't trying to do that. They're trying to get a nice little message, like God's grace, even when you really, really mess up. Is that how we're going to frame this? A big no-no that God got over and gave them grace? No, God endorsed it so he didn't have to give grace. Or a message about, you know what, there's consequences we can't see, which is what Allen's trying to allude to at the end, and I'm not sure what he's talking about. Literally, Israel got no consequence for this, unless you count the parts of Israel that lost their entire families or were taken as sex slaves. But that wasn't God's consequence to them. That was his divine plan to keep the tribes going. Christians need to do a better job knowing their Bible, and they need to do a better job discerning truth, which sounds oxymoronic because you have this pastor who's in leadership over them telling them, God loves you, God has a plan for you, God has grace for you, still be careful with your sin, and look what happens when man just does whatever he wants. And all of that is wrong, even by the standard of the Bible itself. So if they can do that with verses that are so obviously horrendous, think of the confusion that sets in when they talk about what Jesus says in the book of Matthew, what the Apostle Paul quotes back to the Romans. Just once, I'd love for a pastor to say, you know what? I believe in God. Despite the evidence, I believe God is a good God. That's my personal feeling. I can point to some things in the Bible that make sense, and I can share those as good news with you. But I can't make anything out of Judges except that we have a completely immoral God. So I'll cop out by saying his ways are higher, and I don't understand it, and I'm just going to hope for the best and preach from the rest. At least it would be honest. But instead, they just spin, and I don't even think he's like trying to manipulate his group of listeners. I think he honestly read Judges, saw everything ended up okay in the end, was like, look at God's grace for his people, looked at some of the things that happened, was like, well, there's consequence too, though, and then decided to make sure he points out that last verse because no pastor can avoid that, and show us how much we need God, because left to ourselves, we are just evil and wicked. You mean left to the nature that God made us with, or at least allowed us to have, conditioned us with from original sin in our birth. But again, it's a completely moot point because he 100% answered their prayers with, go kill women and children. That was God's plan, not man's plan. I really wanted to get the point across about what is actually happening in Judges here and why pastors should not have the authority they do. It is just a choose your own adventure book, and it's so muddled and so vague and so contradicting that you can literally turn to any page and make up a sermon about it. I think that's what we'll do for a new series. I'm going to take the 20 worst verses in the Bible and I'm going to preach from them like a pastor and show you how manipulative and ugly this religion really is. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day. This Thursday we have Proverbs, so stay tuned for that. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, GVI, Jason, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist hero, Jarrod Nichols, and my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Kristi, and Sparky, as well as all my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in this mission or just enjoy watching the content,